The bitter chill of the Minnesota winter night bit into my skin as I stood shivering on the porch, my arms wrapped tightly around my pregnant belly. "Maybe a night in the cold will cool down your high spirits, Elsie." Dalton's harsh words echoed in my ears as the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. I banged my fists against the unforgiving wood, shouting for him to let me back inside, but there was no response. Hot tears streamed down my cheeks, freezing on my face in the icy air. How could he do this to me? To us? I thought, my hand instinctively cradling my swollen stomach. Minutes ticked by like hours, and my teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Just as I feared I might collapse from the cold, a familiar voice called out from the driveway. "Elsie? What on earth are you doing out here?" Relief washed over me as I recognized my brother-in-law, Rudy. "Dalton. He locked me out." I managed to stammer through chattering teeth. Rudy's face contorted in anger as he rushed towards the door, pounding his fist against it. "Dalton! Open up, you son of a bitch!" After what felt like an eternity, the door finally swung open and Dalton appeared, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "What's all the racket?" "Are you out of your mind?" Rudy shouted, pushing past him and ushering me inside. "Leaving your pregnant wife out in the cold like that? What were you thinking?" Dalton scoffed, his arms folded across his chest. She needed to cool off. She was getting hysterical. My hands trembled as I peeled off my frozen coat, the warmth of the house stinging my skin. "I wasn't being hysterical, Dalton. I was just trying to talk to you about our finances, and you completely shut me down like you always do." Rudy stepped between us, his protective instincts kicking in. "That's no excuse, man. You can't treat her like that, especially in her condition." Dalton's eyes narrowed, and he jabbed a finger in Rudy's direction. "Stay out of this, Rudy. It's between me and my wife." As the two brothers argued, I couldn't help but feel a lingering chill, not from the cold but from the realization that my husband's actions had crossed a line. In that moment, the seeds of doubt were planted, and I knew that things would never be the same between us again. Rudy's eyes burned with rage as he glared at Dalton. "Don't give me that crap, bro. You know what you did was wrong." Dalton sneered, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I don't need a lecture from you, Rudy. Elsie's my wife, and I'll deal with her how I see fit." "Deal with me?" I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "I'm not some kind of problem for you to deal with, Dalton. I'm your wife, the mother of your child." Dalton whirled around, his face twisted in anger. "Don't you dare try to play the victim card with me, Elsie. You knew what you were getting into when you married me." "Enough," Rudy shouted, stepping between us. "This has gone too far, Dalton. Locking Elsie out in the freezing cold? What the hell were you thinking?" Dalton's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might take a swing at his own brother. I was thinking that my hormonal wife needed to cool off before she said something she'd regret. "The only one who's going to regret something is you, bro," Rudy warned, his voice low and dangerous. "If you ever pull a stunt like this again, I swear to God I'll make you pay." Dalton let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Is that a threat, Rudy? Because I'm not afraid of you or anyone else in this family." "It's a promise," Rudy replied, his eyes narrowed. "You've crossed a line, Dalton, and there are going to be consequences." As the two brothers squared off, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel the anger and resentment radiating off of them in waves, and I knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Dalton's sleeping form, I couldn't help but wonder where this all would lead. Rudy's words echoed in my mind. There are going to be consequences. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Dalton would finally face the consequences of his actions. In the days following Rudy's confrontation with Dalton, a palpable tension hung over our house like a dark cloud. Dalton became increasingly distant and withdrawn, spending more and more time away from home. I couldn't help but wonder where he was going and what he was doing. But every time I tried to broach the subject, he brushed me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. It was during one of Dalton's extended absences that I stumbled upon something that would change everything. I was cleaning out his home office, trying to bring some sense of order to the chaos, when I noticed a stack of unopened envelopes stuffed in the back of his desk drawer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slid them out, my heart sinking as I read the return addresses. Various casinos and online gambling sites. As I tore open the envelopes one by one, the true extent of Dalton's betrayal became clear. He had racked up thousands of dollars in gambling debts, mortgaging our future and our child's future in the process. I felt sick to my stomach, the walls closing in around me as I realized the depth of his deception. When Dalton finally returned home later that night, I was waiting for him, the stack of envelopes clutched in my trembling hands. "What is all this?" I demanded, thrusting the papers in his face. He blanched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "It's nothing, Elsie, just some bills, that's all." "Don't lie to me, Dalton," I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. "These are from casinos and gambling sites. How could you do this to us, to our family?" Dalton's expression hardened, and he snatched the envelopes from my grasp. "You had no right going through my things," he growled. "This is none of your business." "None of my business?" I echoed incredulously. "We're supposed to be partners, Dalton, a team. But instead, you've been keeping secrets and racking up debts behind my back." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Like you're one to talk about keeping secrets, Elsie. You think I don't know about your little flirtation with Rudy?" My heart stopped in my chest, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," he spat. "I've seen the way you two look at each other, the lingering touches, the inside jokes. It makes me sick." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "Save it, Elsie. We're both guilty of betrayal here. The only difference is, I'm not ashamed of mine." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. As the weight of his words sank in, I felt a fire ignite within me, a burning desire for revenge, for justice. Dalton had made his choices, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. The next morning, I wasted no time in calling Rudy and asking him to come over. If anyone could help me sort through this mess and figure out a plan of action, it was him. When he arrived, the look of concern on his face was evident. "What's going on, Elsie? You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone." I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout. I found evidence of Dalton's gambling debts. "And that's not all. He's accusing me of having an affair with you." Rudy's eyes widened in shock, and then narrowed in anger. "That son of a bitch! How dare he try to turn this around on you?" "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But that's not even the worst part. He's not ashamed of what he's done, Rudy. He doesn't care that he's put our family's future at risk." Rudy shook his head in disbelief, running a hand through his hair. "Unbelievable. So what are we going to do about this?" A steely resolve settled over me, and I met his gaze with determination. "We're going to make him pay. I want him to face the consequences of his actions once and for all." Rudy nodded, a grim expression on his face. "Whatever you need, Elsie, I'm here for you. Just say the word." Over the next few hours, we pored over the evidence I had gathered, formulating a plan. We would start by contacting a lawyer and exploring our legal options. Dalton's gambling debts and potential financial fraud could be grounds for divorce and a favorable settlement. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted Dalton to face the full weight of his betrayal, both legally and socially. With Rudy's help, I would gather the evidence of his emotional affairs and present it to our family and friends, ensuring that he was ostracized and held accountable for his actions. As the plan took shape, I could feel a sense of empowerment growing within me. For too long I had been the victim in this twisted narrative, but no more. It was time for Dalton to face the consequences of his choices, and I would stop at nothing to make sure justice was served. Rudy must have sensed the determination in my eyes, because he reached across the table and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "We've got this, Elsie. Dalton won't know what hit him." I nodded, squeezing his hand back. "Thank you, Rudy, for everything. I don't know what I'd do without you in my corner." As he flashed me a warm smile, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope for the future. A future where Dalton's toxic influence was nothing but a distant memory, and I could finally begin to rebuild my life on my own terms. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Rudy and I spent every spare moment gathering evidence and building our case against Dalton. I had never felt so focused, so driven in my life. Finally, the day came when Dalton returned from one of his mysterious trips. As soon as he walked through the door, I knew it was time to strike. "Welcome home, honey," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Have a nice trip." He froze in the entryway, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What's going on, Elsie?" "Oh, nothing much," I replied, feigning nonchalance. "Just gathering a little evidence." With a dramatic flourish, I produced a stack of papers and photos, laying them out on the table in front of him. "Care to explain these?" Dalton's face paled as he took in the incriminating documents, bank statements, casino receipts, even grainy photos of him in compromising positions with other women. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Does it really matter?" I shot back. "You've been lying to me for months, Dalton, racking up debts, cheating on me, all while I've been carrying our child." His eyes narrowed to slits, and he jabbed a finger in my direction. "You had no right to go snooping through my things. This is a violation of my privacy." I let out a bitter laugh. "Privacy? You've got to be kidding me. After everything you've done, you have the nerve to talk about privacy?" Rudy, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. "Face it, Dalton, the jig is up. Elsie knows everything, and she's not going to let you get away with it anymore." Dalton whirled on his brother, his face contorted with rage. "Stay out of this, Rudy. This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Rudy retorted, his voice steady and unwavering. "Elsie is my family, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you treat her like garbage anymore." For a moment, it looked like Dalton might lunge at him, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. "What do you want from me, Elsie?" he mumbled, his voice muffled. I straightened my spine, gathering every ounce of strength and determination I had. "I want you to take responsibility for your actions. I want a divorce, and I want you to pay back every single cent you've squandered on your gambling and your mistresses." Dalton's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm deadly serious," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. "You've had your chance, Dalton, and you blew it. Now it's time for you to face the consequences." As I looked into his eyes, I could see the realization dawning, the understanding that his world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For the first time in our marriage, I held all the power, and I wasn't about to let him off the hook. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. True to his nature, Dalton didn't go down without a fight, hiring a high-powered attorney and attempting to discredit me at every turn. "Your Honor, my client's estranged wife is clearly a scorned woman with an axe to grind," Dalton's lawyer drawled during one particularly heated court session. "Her so-called evidence is nothing more than a desperate attempt to paint my client in a negative light." I felt my blood boil as the smarmy lawyer tried to twist the narrative, but Rudy's reassuring presence beside me helped me keep my composure. "That's a load of crap, and you know it," he muttered under his breath. "Stay strong, Elsie. We've got the truth on our side." As the proceedings dragged on, it became clear that Dalton's gambling debts and financial misdeeds were too much for even his high-priced legal team to overcome. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge seemed increasingly unimpressed with his attempts to wriggle out of responsibility. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered his ruling. "Mr. Thompson, the court has reviewed the evidence presented, and it is clear that you have engaged in a pattern of reckless and irresponsible behavior," he said, his voice stern and unyielding. "Your actions have put your family's financial security at grave risk, and your attempts to deflect blame or minimize your wrongdoing are both unacceptable and transparent." Dalton's face was a mask of fury as the judge continued. "In light of these findings, the court is awarding Mrs. Thompson full custody of your unborn child, as well as a substantial portion of your joint assets to ensure her financial stability moving forward. Furthermore, you will be required to pay back the full amount of your gambling debts and any associated legal fees incurred by your estranged wife." As the judge's gavel fell, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was finally over. Dalton had been held accountable for his actions, and I was free to start building a new life for myself and my child. But even as the courtroom cleared, Dalton refused to go quietly. He cornered me in the hallway, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you've won, don't you?" He hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you've gotten your precious revenge, but mark my words, Elsie. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Before I could respond, Rudy was there, stepping between us and pushing Dalton back. "That's enough out of you," he growled. "You lost, Dalton. It's time to accept that and move on." Dalton glared at his brother, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might try to take a swing, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "This isn't over," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll see." As he turned and stormed away, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. But Rudy's reassuring hand on my shoulder helped ground me in the moment. "Don't listen to him, Elsie," he said softly. "It's over. You've got your life back, and he's the one who's going to have to face the consequences of his actions for once." As I looked into Rudy's warm, supportive eyes, I knew he was right. The battle might have been won, but the war was far from over, and I was determined to come out on top, no matter what Dalton threw my way. With Dalton's toxic presence finally gone from my life, it was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely, without the constant fear and anxiety that had plagued me during our marriage. Rudy was there for me every step of the way, helping me sort through the tangled mess of my life and start rebuilding from the ground up. Whether it was lending a hand with practical matters like finding a new place to live or simply providing a listening ear when I needed to vent, his unwavering support was a lifeline that kept me grounded. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Rudy," I told him one evening as we sat on the porch of my new apartment, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset. He flashed me that warm, reassuring smile that had become so familiar. "You'd be just fine, Elsie. You're one of the strongest people I know." I couldn't help but shake my head in disagreement. "I don't know about that. If it wasn't for you standing by my side through all of this, I might have crumbled under the weight of it all." Reaching across the small table between us, Rudy gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "That's what family is for, right? Through thick and thin, we've got each other's backs." As our eyes met, I felt a flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with the impending arrival of my baby. There was a connection between us, a bond that went deeper than just familial ties, and in that moment, I realized that my feelings for Rudy were starting to evolve into something more. Over the next few weeks, as I settled into my new home and prepared for the birth of my child, Rudy was a constant presence in my life. He helped me set up the nursery, paint the walls, and assemble the crib, all while keeping my spirits high with his infectious humor and unwavering positivity. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually excited to be a dad," he joked one day as we put the finishing touches on the nursery. I raised an eyebrow at him, unable to suppress a smile. "Oh, really? And when did you and your wife decide to have a baby?" Rudy laughed, shaking his head. "You know what I mean, smartass. I'm just saying, being there for you, and this little one has really made me think about starting a family of my own someday." As he spoke, his gaze lingered on me, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made my heart skip a beat. In that moment, I knew that my feelings for him were more than just a fleeting crush. They were the beginnings of something real, something deep and unbreakable. And as I looked around at the peaceful sanctuary we had created together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. A future where Dalton was nothing but a distant memory, and the love and support of my newfound family was all that mattered. The first snowflakes of the season were just starting to drift lazily past the window when the contractions began. I gripped the arm of the rocking chair, letting out a sharp gasp of pain as the tightening sensation swept through my abdomen. "Rudy," I called out, my voice strained. "It's time!" Within seconds, he was at my side, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and panic. "Are you sure? Should we call your doctor?" I managed a tight nod, gritting my teeth against another wave of pain. "Yes, call them. And my mom, too. This baby isn't waiting for anyone." As Rudy sprung into action, making the necessary phone calls and gathering our hospital bags, I focused on my breathing, trying to ride out the contractions. It was finally happening. After months of preparation and anticipation, I was about to bring new life into this world. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity, punctuated by moments of intense agony as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. Through it all, Rudy was my rock, coaching me through the pain and offering words of encouragement whenever I felt like giving up. "You've got this, Elsie," he murmured, wiping the sweat from my brow with a cool cloth. "Just breathe, okay? You're doing amazing." When the moment finally arrived and our daughter's tiny cries filled the delivery room, it was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. As I cradled her perfect squirming form against my chest, tears of joy streamed down my face. "She's beautiful," Rudy whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he reached out to stroke her downy head. In that moment, all the pain and turmoil of the past year seemed to melt away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and hope. This tiny, precious life was a symbol of my strength, my resilience, a reminder that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always the promise of rebirth and renewal. As our families began to trickle into the room, cooing over the newest addition and offering their congratulations, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness that Dalton wasn't there to share in this momentous occasion. But then I remembered the hell he had put me through, the betrayal and lies that had nearly torn my world apart, and that feeling quickly dissipated. This was my victory. My triumph over the darkness that had threatened to consume me. And as I looked around at the smiling, supportive faces of my loved ones, my mother, my siblings, and of course Rudy, I knew that I had everything I needed right here. "Thank you," I whispered, catching Rudy's eye, "for being here, for everything." He smiled warmly, reaching out to give my hand a gentle squeeze. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." In that moment, as the snow fell softly outside and our little family celebrated the arrival of new life, I knew that the future was wide open, full of possibilities and promise. The frost of my past with Dalton had finally melted away, and a new chapter was just beginning.